architects, and we are also very engaged with what you could call research in architecture, and in a way this kind of interest has very much shaped the methodology, the pedagogy, if you want, of this diploma unit. I mean, the idea is to really use the opportunity of the architectural project, which is the thing that you deliver at the end, and through which actually you complete your studies, as an opportunity for research. Of course, research today is a word that is quite abused to the point that it's like love when you talk about poetry. Is these words that if you are poets, you should never use the word love, because it's a very banal abused word in that kind of field. And I think the same goes for research in architecture. I think maybe for the next 10 years we should simply avoid the word, so that again, research in architecture maybe have some meaning. Nevertheless, we are very much interested in this aspect. We really believe that architecture, beyond being is not just a form of practice, although this is a very important aspect, but it's also a way of thinking about the world, a way of giving the world a possible representation, which of course use buildings, use projects, use drawing as a means of expression. But I think what is at stake is really something bigger than what, in fact, architecture itself as a professional trade can imply. And in a way, this is exactly what we are always interested. From the beginning, we have always been interested, from the beginning of Diploma 14, we have always been interested in the impact of labor and new forms of working and production within architecture, because in a way, labor working today has become almost the same with living. So the labor is not a specific activity, it's not actually when you sit down and do something, but it coincides with the entire spectrum of social relationships and with life itself. And for us, this is a very important lens through which to assess the evolution and transformations of our urban condition. From the beginning, the unit was very much looking to this phenomena, if you want, from a macro scale. And so we were very interested in the as an architectural response to this phenomena, to the large-scale building. But lately, we have been more and more interested to look to this phenomena from the molecular scale of the house, which is the most, if you want, banal, habitual sphere in which our life, in a way, unfold. And especially this year, we really would like to radically address this topic, going really back to the most minimal unit of space, which is basically the room. Nevertheless, I think that let's say the interest of the unit is actually the very idea of domestic space. I mean, is domestic space a category of the past, or can still make sense as a way to understand the urban condition in which we live? I mean, this is actually for us a very important question that we cannot take for granted. Last year, the title of the unit was very optimistic. It was the Grand Domestic Revolution. A few months ago, I was in IKEA. And actually, there was an advertisement with the Grand Domestic Revolution. So I thought, okay, so no revolution anymore.
We got lost in IKEA. It took us about 1 hour.
Yeah, to find the way out. And so we realized that the Grand Domestic Revolution was not really going to happen. So we became slightly more pessimistic. So the title of this year is Familiar Horror. Revisiting the architecture of the street, the block, and the room. And so as you can see, there is really on one hand an attempt to address the most habitual places of our existence. I mean, I think all of us every day our life is really shaped by these three scales of the city. And of course, we are very interested how the Habitual, which has been actually, it's not so much a favorite place for architecture. I mean, architects usually are interested in the extraordinary, in what actually breaks the norms, what actually goes beyond the expectable. But actually in literature, philosophy, the Habitual has been a very important place of reflection, and this is actually one of the most, for me, haunting representation of domestic space by the Danish painter Hammershøi. Of course, the Habitual is a very ambivalent, the domestic space in this sense is a very ambivalent space, because on one hand it provides us the anchor to give a rhythm, to give a sort of stable sphere to our existence. But precisely for this reason, is also the place where the most sometimes hunting and unstable conditions take place. I think for me this is one of the best representation of this duality of domestic space. I'm sure you will not recognize this house, which is a very banal suburban house in Texas. This actually was the house where what is arguably the most frightening movie ever made in the history of cinema, Texas Chain Massacre, was shooted. And actually what is really unbearable about this movie, which I'm sure you have seen, was actually made in 1975 with a very low budget, so the production could only afford a very unremarkable place like this one. Actually, what is really amazing about this movie is that it's not so much fear that the movie produced on the spectators, but more anguish, precisely because the banality of the place in which the movie takes place, which really increased our sense of anguish, because the most habitual, let's say, conditions of our existence are put radically in question. Now, this is actually what I would call familiar horror. But familiar horror actually has a long history, exactly when the house is no longer this retreat, safe retreat for people away from the harshness of the city, but actually when house becomes really an infrastructure, a machine. I mean, as Le Corbusier would say, a machine for living. This is a famous section of the street by 18th century French engineer Pier, who actually in a very merciless way shows how the house actually is in fact a piece of infrastructure, completely controlled and reproduced by mechanics. And actually, it seems that the only role left to the architect as a form a giver is actually reduced to this beautiful obelisk in the middle. So all the rest is something that's within our way to address through architecture the city is almost take for granted. But this picture also shows a complete reification of life. I mean, how life, which to us appears a sequence of unpredictable events, is somehow really standardized by norms and protocols, which in fact still construct the domestic space. I mean, domestic space, even if it looks to us informal, spontaneous, is in fact highly regulated by rules, protocols, which don't have an architectural representation. Nevertheless, they really give to space a very specific definition. I think for me, this drawing by Patte shows that kind of nature of domestic space, and shows how the horror, the familiar horror, is really the attempt to, in a way, reify what until then was the most familiar, the most, if you want, cherished space for the family and for the individual. So we are very interested in, this year actually the key word of our research will be the habitual, really this kind of pattern structure that even beyond our consciousness defines our life. The habitual actually is a condition that is very much bound to the concept of ethics. Unfortunately, today there is a kind of way to address ethics as the realm of good values. And I think this is a very reductive understanding of what ethics is. Ethics, actually, we're very interested to go back to the etymological origin of ethic, which is ethos. And ethos, actually, in ancient civilizations, like such as ancient Greece, was understood as the very grammar, the very infrastructure of politics. I mean, politics was not understood as only the spectacle of politics, the demonstration, the elections, these moments in which we all become interested in politics, which is unfortunately the way in which we engage politics today. But more on the way the habitual, the ethos, the character of a society is shaped even by the most daily and unremarkable routines. And this is exactly where we think the political today can be rediscovered, not in the kind of banal way in which, unfortunately, we are used to today. So, of course, in architecture, the problem that today is very difficult to define the habitual, precisely because our habit, the most common habit that we have, is to not have habits. This is exactly what's production, way of living required to us, to be at home where a home does not exist, where we are completely uprooted. So in a way, the very difficult task today for us is to redefine an idea of the habitual, where in fact the habitual has been completely disintegrated by new forms of production, by the lack of schedules, by the very idiosyncratic rhythm through which life is organized, towards which we are constantly out of sync. And of course, what is interesting for us is that this kind of condition, on one hand, is radical and is actually reifying all our existence and space to the point that you can hardly distinguish the place of living and working, as you can see in this photograph, which is very familiar more and more to us as a place of work. But we are also interested in another phenomena, which is very much symbolized in this picture, which I think really explain, from our point of view, really what is the problem of today forms of life. So on one hand, there is this complete disintegration and deconstruction of our way of living to the point that all our habitual habits are being actually standardized as very specific commodities, which are very explicitly exhibit in this storage. But at the same time, we are also forced by still trying to cope with this reality by relying on the most traditional forms of life, marriage, couples, families. I mean, all the, let's say, social conditions that are imposed on us, while actually our life is basically being transformed into an increasing realm of commodities that in fact almost deconstruct all our moments of our existence. So when we talk about domestic space, we really have to take into account this landscape. We cannot actually just look to the house. The pitched roof is still, of course, a very powerful symbol. The family apartment is still actually what developers are trying to provide to the market. But the house has become this kind of storage in which all the components, all the elements are basically produced almost, as you can see, in a kind of industrial scale. I think for me, it's interesting to compare these two images. No? On top, you see really this storage in which all domestic components are ready to be consumed. And at the same time, you see how architects, I mean, this is a house designed by actually a very good architect, David Ajaye. So I'm not going to criticize him, of course. But for me, actually, it shows really this kind of longing that is really typical of architect to still restore the aura of domestic space. So you have this kind of authenticity of materials. Actually, if you look to magazine today, you realize how many architects use timber. Timber is having actually a renaissance in the last 10 years. Of course, timber is the material that evoke nature, authenticity, belonging to the place. So, of course, the green courtyard is another fetish. The chairs, you know, the reconstruction of a kind of heaven. But of course, this kind of ideology is very much trying to mystify, basically, the way, in fact, space is today produced. And we are, of course, not trying to go beyond this, because as architects, it's very difficult. I mean, I think you would be lucky in your career if you would be able to design something like this. But I think we are very interested to open up this contradiction. I mean, to open up the familiar horror that is present even in the most well-designed, extremely refined piece of domestic space. And yet, actually, in the past, there were attempts to, instead, to not cover this industrialization of living. We are very interested in a lineage of experiments about domestic space, such as the American Woman House designed by the sister Beechers, where they really trying from the very realm of the domestic to rearrange the house in order, in this case, of course, liberate women from the oppression of domestic labor. And of course, this is always a very tricky, let's say, experiments, because we know from the evolution of domestic space how the more you want to make efficient domestic space, the more it increases a certain kind of level of maintenance. Yet, for us is interesting is that here the problem of domestic space is really addressed from the materialistic point of view, from the point of view of how domestic space is infrastructure. And the house, as you can see, was not trying to hide, to gloss over this condition of domestic space. Another experiment that for us is terribly important is this one, which I'm sure you all know. It's Margaret Lisowski design for the Frankfurt kitchen, arguably one of the most important projects of the modern movement, which unfortunately, even if you take Kenneth Frampton, modern history of architecture is completely absent, partly also for obvious reason that she was a woman, and until recently, of course, a woman was not supposed to be an architect who actually had an influence on Ernst May in his Frankfurt projects of social housing. She designed this kitchen, which has been an incredible revolution in the way the kitchen is organized. I mean, all of us today have a Frankfurt kitchen, even though it's not, of course, the original model. And what is interesting about the Frankfurt kitchen is that Margaret Lisowski really applied the logic of the factory into domestic space. So instead of hiding this reification of domestic space, she exposed it to almost a radical degree, to the point that all the walls that make the kitchen are in fact built in infrastructure. And of course, this for us is really an example how a project of architecture, a project of design is not just a solution of a problem, but is really the opening up of a series of social and political problems that really find in the microcosm of the house the most powerful, let's say, place of action. Of course, as we are also interested in the way the industrialization of the house has produced specific representations. This is actually a series of a photograph by Louis Boltz called Tract Houses. And Boltz was making these photographs at the very height of the suburban American dream, which of course today has quite collapsed. It's no longer a dream, it's a nightmare. And of course, he exposed the brutality of this condition. Again, like Pate, also Boltz is very interested to show the blankness, the lack of identity, the generic character of domestic space. But there is also something interesting in his work. He's not just trying to make a critique. His work is not a sociological j'accuse, like many reportages, especially in architecture, are usually doing. He also shows a certain unexpected qualities of this space. I mean, the moment the space reaches its most unbearable commodification, is precisely there that there is a hint for some radical alternative projects. And we really like this kind of dialectic, where there is danger, there is, as Oderlin famously say, where there is danger, there is also salvation. And I think salvation cannot happen without actually trying to address these moments of danger. So to organize the studio, we have trying to really look to this phenomena from three scales, which will be the scale of our both analysis and project. The street, which of course is its linearity always suggests this kind of idea of peaceful coexistence of people, but I think precisely that aspect has to be seen as trying to tame the opposite, the fact that coexistence and movement are among the most difficult things to achieve within a city historically. So the street was really an invention to achieve that condition. The block, again, something that we take for granted, something that we believe almost grow naturally out of the street pattern, but again, the block is also a form not only of architectural invention, but also of social and political engineer, where problems of jurisdiction of space, problems of private and public space, problems of infrastructure all come together into a very specific form, which today is a very common form, but is in fact one of the most, let's say, radical forms of organizing actually a city. So we are very interested to really go back to these common places. So the studio is really trying to really go back to the basics, if you want. And of course, finally, the room. I mean, the space that all of us know very well. Actually, we are very interested also that those who work in the unit in a way use their own experience as the ground of experimentation and design. And in fact, the room is arguably one of the most radical spaces of ethical reinvention, where our habits can be transformed almost consciously. And that's actually why the room is a very important item this year in our, and actually will be the starting point. I mean, really the architecture of the room, the architecture of the most common, banal, if you want, place within the city. So if you look to these three scales, I mean, you might wonder that we have left something out, which is exactly what we want to challenge with this research, which is the family apartment. Not because we are against the family. Of course, family is still very important. Long live to the family. So don't take us as kind of radical hippies who try to argue for communes or these kind of things. Not at all. I wish to all of you to have a family in your future. But of course, the family is also, I mean, cannot be the only, social unit to which domestic space have to be offered. I mean, this is really a problem of market, of housing today. Developers are only interested in the family. I mean, even if they know that there are a lot of subjects who are beside or beyond this social format, if you want, the family has remained really the unit through which actually not only domestic space, but the city itself is actually being developed. And I think this for us is a very important challenge, not of course negates the family, but to try to go beyond, to question this. No? This is exactly the template through which the entire city is basically built. Of course, maybe this is a very old example. Today is even actually, what is interesting that today houses are much smaller than this one. The average square meters of a house for middle class, if middle class still exists, I'm not sure, is much smaller. This is actually a drawing from, I think, more than 20 years ago. But what is interesting is that the number of rooms is still the same. So on one hand, you see how the house is shrinking, because of course it's used in a much more volatile way than in the past. And of course people have no time to maintain actually a very big mansion or a very big space. But of course symbolically the house has to remain the house. And in fact there should be still 2 bedrooms apartments with living room, with kitchen, which means that these spaces are incredibly small. And this is really where the familiar horror, I mean, the shrinking of the house and still the pretense that we are living into the house with the with its all traditional attributes, is for us really one of the subjective, let's say, source of the current crisis, which is not only economic, but also is a subjective crisis. So I leave now.
Yes, it's also very much a psychological crisis, or anyway, I mean, a moment of tension that we all live in our everyday life. And as you all know, of course, this problem of the subject or the question of the subject has always been at the center of our attention. This year will be all the more so in the sense that we want to slightly change our methodology for the year and focus on a kind of analysis that we never did in the past. Is a new thing also for us. These are actually examples of what we are going to do in the beginning of the year. That is actually to do an analysis that is more focused on cultural artifacts that are not necessarily architecture, but next to architecture. Namely, paintings. Here, maybe some of you might recognize actually the famous painting by Antonello da Messina, currently on show at the National Gallery. Paintings, but also films, also literature, and anyway, I mean, let's say other cultural products that we ask you, that we will ask the participants of the unit to analyze from a spatial point of view. So for instance, here what was done was actually a redrawing in CAD without the protagonist, obviously, without the Saint Jerome that should be here in his study, of the space as a 2D line drawing actually starting from a painting. And so on and so forth. This is another space that some of you might recognize, actually John Soane's study. They are all rooms for one single person, or the room in which actually Marcel Proust actually spent the last years of his life, or the room in which Italian painter Morandi actually both lived and worked. But what is common in those four examples is that actually we are trying to use an artifact, in this case they are paintings or real spaces, and we try to decrypt them by looking at them from a spatial point of view. So for us, it's a new kind of analysis that is quite interesting because instead of inserting new, let's say, narrative layers on top of simple plans and sections, we do it the other way around. So we take real examples and then we try to actually read them spatially. This could also entail, for instance, I don't know, redrawing a space of a crucial scene from a movie or from a novel. Of course, this thing is not value-free. The reason why we do that is that we think that this exercise might lead us to consider in a stronger, more and sharper way what is the relationship between the subject, the space, and the way in which actually the subject perceives or represents his or her own space. That's why I think, I mean, we think that this kind of interface of the artist in certain cases, or the filmmaker or the writer is important because actually there is this kind of extra layer of representation that is in between the user, let's say, and the space itself. So that's the way in which we would like to start the year, actually through an analysis of one artifact that should lead the participants to ask themselves a question about the subject, ultimately. So for us, it's very important that the work should be a thesis, basically, and the thesis should start with a question on the subject and on the way in which the subject uses the space and the ways in which actually different cultures have represented this space. So after that, we have another phase of analysis that is something that is perhaps more matter of fact, that is a moment in which we would like to actually look very carefully at the urban anatomy of the city that each individual person will choose. As usual, we don't tell you what to do. You can choose whatever city you like for your thesis. Of course, we will be together developing it step by step. This analysis also this year will be a little bit different from other years because as we want to tackle, especially the scale of the block and the scale of the street, it has to be an analysis actually of the urban anatomy of the city. For instance, here you see student work from previous years in Barcelona, where actually the analysis of the block was done again through redrawing. We really believe in redrawing, even sometimes very, very deadpan redrawing as a way to appropriate the artifact itself and to understand it by simply redrawing it. And the reason why the urban anatomy analysis this year is particularly important is because we really want to insist on the fact that the three scales that we want to address are the street, block, and room, which are at the same time incredibly cliched or obvious or commonplace, but if you really think about it, they are three scales at which, as architects, we almost never work. Normally, we work at the scale of the apartment. You know, many of you already have been on the year out. You know how it works in a commercial office. You normally draw typologies from the apartment, from the cell, or you draw objects, Or in certain cases, those of us who have experience as urban designers, you draw master plans that are basically hatches and lines and very abstract things. On the contrary, here we have three scales that are very architectural. So the block can always be read, and you see here, as one piece of architecture, of course composed by many different projects, many different actors, many different owners, which is very important for us because the problem of jurisdiction and ownership will actually be at the center of our attention, but still it's an architectural construct. So the urban anatomy analysis is important because that's the moment in which actually you should start to acquire the tools that will enable you to design at these two scales, the block and the street, that although they seem extremely obvious, in fact, are very underrepresented, I would say, in projects of architecture from Alberti onwards. Of course, in antiquity it was different. We have kind of a fetish, let's say, plan that is actually this plan from a block in Paris that we think is, in a way, the diagram of the crisis of the relationship between city and architecture for us. Because you see it here, the city has a very, very strong form. It's the star-shaped plan of Paris. But also, you can see that also the apartments start to have a pattern, a very methodically constructed, clearly repeatable pattern that until the 1800s didn't exist. So these two things start to battle. I mean, there is a struggle, basically, between drawing from the cell to the city and drawing from the city to the cell. Of course, you all know that actually what the methodology that won in the last 100 years, since the modern movement onwards, is actually the methodology that leads you to design from the cell outwards, from the machine that actually shapes the nuclear family as that diagram on which the whole society is based, outwards. That means that often we see cities that are unreadable, they don't really have a form, that there is no real project for the city as such, as a collective work of art, if you want. So for us, going back to the block and going back to the street is exactly the moment in which we would like to address this tension between the public domain, between the street, and the private domain, so the typology, the machine for living, basically. So in a nutshell, actually, the attempt to relook at back at these three scales that seem obvious but are not, is for us the possibility to reinvent not only the life of the individual, but also the life of the city in general. To reinvent also a form for the city. So what we would like to put forward this year is not only, and most importantly, I would say, this molecular revolution of alternatives for the individual, starting from the room and starting from the very self, actually, that occupies the space, but also how a collection of these selves can come together into the creation of something that is actually much, much more larger scale. It is actually ultimately a horizon for the city and for where the urban culture actually is going potentially in the future, which we still think that is a question that is absolutely crucial, because ultimately the city is a piece of architecture constructed by many different actors, but is something that has a form and that should be discussed if we want to have actually a future for us and for the profession.
Yeah, just two things to conclude. Of course, as you know, or perhaps this is for us very important, I mean, theory for Diploma 14 is very important. As I said before, we really believe architecture cannot just be practice of, but has to be a form of knowledge. But we also believe that theory always starts from experience. In other words, we really believe that our subjective experience, the way we live, is the source of the coordinates of how we can build a theory of the city. Of course, that doesn't mean that we are personal, that we communicate our ideas as opinions. We have to be very rigorous, and this rigor is built with drawings, with writings, with a very intelligible forms of representation. But as you can see also in this very beautiful painting by Gerhard Richter, which is in a way the starting point of our project, the subject is very much the centerpiece of the whole story. And I think to always remind ourselves for whom we make architecture is the most important research question. Of course, having said that, the kind of students we expect, we like, are students who are very, very interested and motivated towards architecture, You can do, actually, in our unit, you can do whatever you want. You can think whatever you want, but you have to love architecture. I mean, and I'm not saying that, let's say, easily. We know that architecture today is the most demotivating, downgrading profession you can imagine. So I'm not celebrating architecture as a kind of idyllic profession. On the contrary, we are very disenchanted towards the profession, but it's precisely this kind of disenchantment that in somehow feeds our enthusiasm and our love for architecture, and this is exactly at the end what we expect from our students, a kind of obsessive love for architecture. Thank you.